As we work with rational expressions, basically fractions, we're going to see negatives come up quite a bit. And I wanted to remind you of how negatives work with fractions. Here's an example where we have negative 3/2. The negative's out front, but we could also write the negative in the numerator as negative 3/2, or we could write it in the denominator as 3 over negative 2. All three of these ways of writing the negative in the fraction are proper, and they're all equivalent. So there are often three ways you can see answers when there's a negative in the fraction or the rational expression you're working with. It's also important to recognize when you have a negative, because sometimes the negative factor is hiding when you might have something there that you might be able to simplify. Let's take a look at these examples. We have 3 minus x over x minus 3. One thing you'll note is that the numerator and denominator are written in different forms. The numerator is written in what we call ascending order. The constant comes first and the variable after, and the denominator is written in descending order, where the variable comes first and then the constant. It's best when we're working with fractions to write things in the same way. So write everything generally in descending order when you see it. In the numerator, let's change that to negative x plus 3. Remember, the sign in front of a term goes with it. In the denominator, just keep it as x minus 3. Now we have both the numerator and denominator in descending order. One thing you'll note is that the first term in the numerator now starts with a negative. A hint, sometimes that means that there's a negative factor involved. Let's factor out a negative 1 and see what's left. Negative x divided by negative 1 is x. Positive 3 divided by negative 1 is negative 3. The denominator is still negative 3. X minus 3, I should say. And what we now can see is that there's an x minus 3 that's a common factor in both the numerator and denominator. And as such, we can cancel it out. Now when we cancel, there's always going to be a 1 left. But a 1 left in the denominator doesn't have to be written that way. We can just write negative 1 over 1, or just negative 1. So this fraction simplifies to quite a simple expression, just simply negative 1. But it was hard to see from where it was at the beginning. You needed to really rewrite things in the same order to be able to see how that would simplify. Here's another example, x squared minus 12x plus 35 over 49 minus x squared. The denominator, you notice, is not written in descending order. So let's write both parts of the fraction in the same way. So the numerator stays in descending order. The denominator gets rewritten as negative x squared plus 49. Notice the negative in front of the x squared. That's the hint to factor a negative 1. When we factor a negative 1 out of the denominator, the numerator doesn't change. The negative 1 will come out, and we'll get left with x squared minus 49. The x squared minus 49 is a difference of squares, so we're going to be able to factor that further. So the negative 1 remains, and we get x plus 7, x minus 7. Don't forget that we do need to factor the numerator to see if anything will be simplified. So when we factor the trinomial into two binomials, we're going to split the x squared into x and x. Then we want two factors of positive 35 that give us negative 12. That would be negative 7 and negative 5. Again, they multiply to positive 35 but add to negative 12. Once we have the numerator and denominator factored, we can look for common factors to cancel. The x minus 7s are such, and what we're left with in the numerator is x minus 5, and I don't need parentheses anymore because it's the only thing there. In the denominator, negative 1 times x plus 7. Now notice that negative is in the denominator. That's similar to how we have this original fraction up top written, the negative in the denominator. There's nothing wrong with that, but what you'll often see many people do is move that negative out front. So like we see in this first fraction. So the negative moves out front of the entire answer, so we get negative fraction x minus 5 over x plus 7. That's a very common way you could show the answer. Either one of these, this one or this one, would be perfectly acceptable, though, in terms of a quiz or a homework assignment. But I wanted to show you that both are proper. In our third example, we actually have two variables involved, a and b. We don't really have descending order when we have two variables, but one of the things you still want to do is write both the numerator and denominator in the same way. So in the numerator, we have a written before b. So we want to do the same thing in the denominator. So write that as negative a squared plus b squared. Remember, the sign goes with the term. Now, because the denominator starts with a negative, factor a negative 1 out. So you'll get a squared minus b squared when you factor the negative 1 out. And the numerator is still a minus b. This stuff in the parentheses in the denominator is a difference of squares, so we can factor that further. So our numerator remains a minus b. Our denominator retains the negative 1, and then we factor the difference of squares to get a plus b, a minus b. We can now see that we have an a minus b that's common. Remember, when we cancel something, we're left with a 1. That's important in this numerator because we do want to show that we still have a numerator, in this case 1, over negative 1 times a plus b. Once again, there's that negative in the denominator. A lot of people will leave it there, but you'll also see it commonly written out front, so negative fraction 1 over a plus b. You'll also see sometimes people will write it in top as negative 1 over a plus b. All three of these ways of writing the final answer would be perfectly acceptable.